Canada has just sent a signal that Washington cannot ignore, and it did not come through an aggressive speech. It did not come through a military threat. It did not come through an insult in front of the cameras. It came through something much colder, much quieter, and perhaps much more dangerous for Donald Trump. It came through money. Nearly 97 billion Canadian dollars in foreign direct investment, a massive number, a number that by itself already grabs attention. But the most important thing is not just the number. The most important thing is the timing, because this figure appears precisely as Donald Trump is once again pressuring Canada with tariffs, trade threats, tension over the USMCA, and a strategy that seems designed to remind Ottawa who controls North America. But this time, Canada did not respond the way it used to. This time, Canada did not simply wait. This time, Mark Carney made a decision that could change the tone of the entire relationship. He went to New York, but not as a prime minister looking for a nice photo opportunity, not as a politician looking for applause, not as someone asking for permission. Carney is traveling to New York to sit in front of the money, in front of Wall Street, in front of investors, in front of chief executives, in front of capital managers, in front of the people who can move billions of dollars with a single decision. And the message he is carrying is clear. Canada no longer wants to wait for Washington to decide its future. Canada wants to open another door, an economic door, a strategic door, a door that if fully opened could weaken one of Trump's favorite weapons, trade pressure. Because for decades, Canada lived with an uncomfortable reality. The United States was its biggest partner, its most important market, its most powerful neighbor, its closest ally, and at the same time, its greatest vulnerability. That may sound contradictory, but that is exactly the problem. When your economy depends too much on one country, that country has power over you. It can raise tariffs, it can block products, it can change rules, it can threaten entire industries, it can use the border as a political lever. And that is something Trump understands perfectly. For Trump, trade is not just trade. It is pressure, it is negotiation, it is force. It is a way to make the other side sit at the table at a disadvantage. And for months, Canada has lived under that shadow. The shadow of tariffs, the shadow of uncertainty, the shadow of a Washington that no longer behaves like a stable partner, but like an unpredictable actor. One day it talks about agreements, the next day it talks about punishment. One day it mentions cooperation, the next day it demands more concessions. One day it praises the relationship with Canada, the next day it launches threats that hit workers, factories, exporters, and business owners. And in the face of that situation, Carney seems to have reached a very simple conclusion. Canada cannot control what Trump does, but it can control how dependent it wants to remain on Trump. And that is where this story begins. Because Carney's trip to New York should not be seen as just another meeting.
It should be seen as a power move, a different kind of move. A move without shouting, a move without spectacle, but with a very clear intention. If the United States wants to use trade as a weapon, Canada has to look for more capital, more markets, more investors, and more options. Because in an economic war, the most vulnerable country is not necessarily the smallest one. The most vulnerable country is the one with no alternatives. And Carney is trying to build alternatives. That is the key. This is not just about attracting money. This is about changing Canada's position on the board. For years, Canada was seen as a reliable partner, a stable country, close to the United States, integrated into the North American market. But now Carney wants to sell a different image. He wants to present Canada as an investment refuge, as a safe economy in the middle of chaos, as a country with resources the world needs, as an energy platform, as a power in critical minerals, as a place where global capital can find stability while other countries build walls and threaten trade wars. And that is where the number appears. the number that makes this story feel much bigger. Nearly 97 billion Canadian dollars in foreign direct investment during the 2025 outing, the highest figure since 2007. This is not a small amount. It is not a boring technical detail hidden inside a report. It is a signal that despite uncertainty, international money is still entering Canada. A signal that investors have not abandoned the country. A signal that Canada can still attract capital even in the middle of a complicated relationship with the United States. But we also have to say this clearly. Carney did not get those $97 billion in a single trip. It would not be accurate to say that. The figure belongs to the entire year of 2025, and an important part came from mergers and acquisitions, in other words, the purchase of companies or assets that already existed. That means not all of that money represents new factories, new jobs, or new projects built from scratch. But politically, the figure is powerful, because Carney can arrive in New York and say, Canada is already attracting capital. Now we want to accelerate. And that word is essential, accelerate. Because the Canadian government does not only want to show what happened in 2025, it wants to use it as a starting point. It wants to build a narrative. It wants to convince the world that Canada is entering a new stage, a stage where Canada is no longer enough to be the quiet neighbor of the United States, a stage where Canada wants to become a global investment hub, a stage where investors do not see Canada as an extension of the American economy, but as an opportunity of its own. And that, even if it sounds technical, carries enormous political weight. Because if Canada manages to attract more international capital, Trump's pressure loses strength. If Canada manages to open new trade routes, Trump's pressure loses strength. If Canada manages to sell more energy, more minerals, more technology, and more strategic products to other markets, Trump's pressure loses strength. And if Canada manages to convince Wall Street that its future does not depend only on Washington, then something changes, something deep, something that could make the White House uncomfortable. Because Trump has built much of his strategy around one idea: the United States is the center, and everyone else must adapt. Mexico must adapt, Canada must adapt, Europe must adapt, China must give in, allies must pay, partners must accept. And when someone does not accept, tariffs come, threats come, headlines come, pressure comes. But Carney seems to be responding with a different logic, a quieter logic, but a more strategic one. He is not simply saying, we are going to resist. He is saying, we are going to become harder to pressure. And that is much more important, because resisting means taking the hit, but building alternatives means weakening the hit. And that may be exactly what is happening. Carney is trying to make Canada stop being a country that reacts to Trump and start being a country that forces Trump to react. That shift is enormous, because for a long time, the story was always the same. Trump spoke, Canada responded. Trump threatened, Canada defended itself. Trump applied pressure, Canada looked for protection. But now the picture is different.
Trump pressures with tariffs, and Carney goes to New York to seek capital. Trump talks about tougher trade rules, and Carney talks with investors. Trump wants to make dependence on North American trade more expensive, and Carney begins selling the idea of a Canada that is more open to the world. This is not an emotional response, it is an economic response. And that is why it may be more dangerous, because one threat can be answered with another threat. One speech can be answered with another speech. But when money begins to move, the conversation changes. Markets do not listen only to speeches. Markets look at opportunities. They look at stability. They look at resources. They look at infrastructure. They look at rules. They look at the future. And Canada wants to present itself as an answer to chaos. That is Carney's real message. While other countries close themselves off, Canada wants to open up. While Trump threatens tariffs, Canada wants to attract investment. While Washington turns trade into a political battle, Ottawa wants to turn stability into an advantage. And that is a strong narrative, a very strong one, because this is not just about the economy, it is about power. Power to negotiate, power to resist, power to decide, power to avoid depending on a single border, power to look at Washington and say, yes, the United States is important, but it is no longer our only option. And that phrase, even if it is not said officially, is the true heart of this story. Canada cannot break with the United States. That would be impossible. The two economies are far too connected. Supply chains cross the border every single day. The auto industry depends on parts that travel from one country to the other several times before a car is finished. Steel, aluminum, energy, food, lumber, manufacturing, technology, everything is connected. Canada cannot simply wake up one morning and say, "We no longer need the United States." That would be false. But it also cannot continue acting as if there is no risk, because the risk is already in front of everyone. When Washington changes its position from one day to the next, companies slow down. When Trump threatens tariffs, investors hesitate. When the future of the USMCA becomes uncertain, factories do not know whether to expand or wait. When trade rules can change because of political decisions, capital becomes more cautious. And that affects Canada. It affects jobs. It affects investments. It affects entire regions. It affects the auto sector. It affects steel. It affects aluminum. It affects producers who built their business model around the American border. That is why Carney has an urgent problem. He cannot wait for Trump to calm down. He cannot wait for Washington to send perfect signals. He cannot wait for the relationship to magically return to normal. Because maybe that normal no longer exists. Maybe the relationship between Canada and the United States has changed forever. And if it has changed forever, Canada needs a new strategy. That strategy has 3 words: investment, diversification, and control. Investment to build more internal capacity. Diversification so Canada does not depend so much on a single market. And control so that decisions made in Washington do not paralyze Canada's future. That is why the trip to New York is so symbolic, because New York is not just any city. New York is the financial heart. It is where the language of capital is spoken. It is where a strong signal can attract billions. It is where investors watch which country is ready to grow and which country is trapped in uncertainty. Carney knows this. He is not arriving as just another politician. He arrives with economic credibility. He arrives with market experience. He arrives with a message designed for an audience that is not easily impressed. And that audience wants to hear one thing: why Canada? Why now? Why put money there? And Carney has several answers. Because Canada has natural resources the world needs. Because it has critical minerals at a time when technology, electric vehicles, defense, and clean energy depend on those materials. Because it has energy. Because it has agricultural capability. Because it has water. Because it has relatively stable institutions. Because it has access to both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Because it can serve as a bridge between markets. Because in the middle of global political noise, Canada can sell itself as a less chaotic place. But that is not enough. Investors also want speed. They want clear permits. They want infrastructure. They want projects that do not take a decade to begin. They want legal certainty. They want signs that the government doesn't just talk, but executes. And that is Carney's great challenge, turning the speech into reality. Because a country can have resources, but if it does not have roads, ports, railways, permits, and clear agreements, the money goes somewhere else. A country can have critical minerals, but if extracting them takes years of internal battles, capital gets tired. A country can have energy, but if it cannot move it to the markets that need it, it loses the opportunity. A country can have talent, but if bureaucracy blocks investment, talent is not enough. That is why Carney's bet is so big, because he is not only trying to attract money, he is trying to convince the world that Canada can move faster. And for Canada, that is not an easy task. There are internal tensions, there are provinces with different interests, there are environmental debates, there are indigenous communities that must be consulted and respected. There are sectors that want traditional energy, there are sectors that want a clean transition. There are companies that want less regulation. There are citizens who fear investment will only benefit big capital.
And in the middle of all that, Carney has to build a path that works. But what makes this story so attractive is that the external context is giving it urgency. Trump is applying pressure. Washington is hardening its language. The USMCA review is approaching with growing nervousness. Companies do not know which rules will dominate North America in the coming years, and Canada does not want to arrive at that table as a cornered country.
Canada does not want to arrive at the negotiating table empty-handed. It wants to arrive with cards, with options, with backing, with proof that the world is still willing to invest in its future. Because in any negotiation, what you say matters, but what the other side believes you can do matters even more. If Trump believes Canada has no way out, he can pressure harder. If he believes Canada depends completely on the United States, he can demand more. If he believes Canada cannot survive a trade hit, he can raise the stakes. But if Canada proves that it can attract global capital, strengthen strategic industries, and build economic relationships beyond Washington, then the entire negotiation changes. It does not become easy, but it changes. And that is exactly what Mark Carney appears to be trying to do. Not with one meeting, not with one speech, not with one press conference, but with a bigger national message. Canada no longer wants to live under the shadow of every American trade threat. Canada wants to be more than an extension of the United States economy. Canada wants to become a serious investment hub in a world searching for stability. And that is why the $97 billion matter. Because those $97 billion are not just money. They are a message to Wall Street, a message to Ottawa, a message to Canadian companies, and of course, a message to Washington. The message is simple. Canada is still in the game. Canada is still attracting capital. Canada is not paralyzed. Canada is not waiting on its knees. And if Trump thought trade pressure would leave Canada frozen, Carney wants to prove the opposite. He wants to show that pressure can become momentum, that a threat can become strategy, that a crisis can become opportunity. But there is one question nobody can ignore. Will it be enough? Because $97 billion sounds enormous, but an economy is not transformed by a number alone. It is transformed by projects, by jobs, by factories, by infrastructure, by exports, by technology, by productivity, and by difficult decisions. That is where Carney has to prove this is not just a public relations campaign. He has to prove he can turn investor interest into real investment. He has to prove he can move capital into strategic sectors. He has to prove Canada can compete in a world where every country is fighting for the same money. The United States wants investment. Europe wants investment. Mexico wants investment. India wants investment. Southeast Asia wants factories. The entire world is competing. And capital does not wait forever. Capital moves toward opportunity, security, and speed. That is why Carney has little room to fail. If he goes to New York and only gives speeches, the impact may fade quickly. But if he opens real conversations, connects projects with money, and convinces investors to bet on Canada, then this trip could become the beginning of something much bigger. Something that may not be fully visible tomorrow or next week, but something that can begin now. Because major economic shifts do not always begin with explosions. Sometimes they begin behind closed doors, with quiet conversations, with investors listening, with governments preparing the ground, with one small phrase that later becomes national policy. And maybe that is what we are watching now. A Canada that is beginning to look beyond the United States, not to abandon the United States, but to depend less on it. And that may be the smartest response to Trump's pressure. Because Trump understands direct confrontation. He understands insults. He understands threats. He understands the strong response. But it is harder to attack a strategy that presents itself as growth. How do you attack a country for seeking investment? How do you attack a country for strengthening its economy? How do you attack a country for diversifying its markets? How do you attack a country for wanting to be less vulnerable? That is the brilliant part of Carney's move. He does not need to declare a trade war. He does not need to insult Trump. He does not need to say Washington is the enemy. He only needs to show that Canada has a plan. And if that plan works, the political effect becomes inevitable. Every time Canada gains a new option, the United States loses part of its ability to impose fear. Every time Canada attracts investment outside Washington's orbit, Trump loses some control over the conversation. Every time Canada strengthens its strategic sectors, Ottawa arrives stronger at the negotiating table. And every time Wall Street listens to Carney, the story changes. It is no longer just Trump pressuring Canada. Now it is Canada trying to move the money before Trump moves the next threat. And that makes the story more intense, because this is not a traditional fight. There are no tanks.
No closed borders, no military clash. This is something more modern, a war of economic influence, a battle for investment, a competition over who controls the industrial future of North America. Trump wants more production inside the United States. He wants tougher rules. He wants to use tariffs to push companies toward his agenda. But Canada does not want to be reduced to a secondary piece. Canada wants to say, we also have resources. We also have talent. We also can attract capital. We also can build the future. And if Carney sells that idea successfully, Trump is no longer negotiating with a still Canada. He is negotiating with a Canada that is moving, and a country that moves is harder to corner. That is why this moment matters. Carney does not need to win everything in one day. He only needs to begin changing perception, and in economic politics, perception is everything. If investors believe Canada is waking up, the money starts looking. If companies believe Canada can become a strategic platform, conversations begin. If markets believe Ottawa has a serious plan, confidence grows. And if Washington sees Canada building options, Trump's pressure may begin to lose force. But there is also a risk. If Carney promises too much and delivers too little, the story can turn against him. Big numbers create big expectations. When a government talks about $97 billion, Wall Street, investment, and $1 trillion goal, people expect results. They expect jobs. They expect growth. They expect wages. They expect visible projects. They expect something to change in real life, not just in official statements. Because an economic strategy cannot live only in headlines. It has to reach factories, ports, roads, workers, communities, small businesses, and the sectors that today fear the impact of tariffs. If the money stays only in corporate purchases and financial movements, the narrative can weaken. But if the money becomes real projects, Canada could enter a new stage, a historic stage. For the first time in a long time, Canada may be using pressure from the United States as a reason to strengthen itself internally, not just to complain, not just to defend itself, not just to negotiate, but to change its model, to look toward Europe, toward Asia, toward global investors, toward its own potential. And that is why this story connects, because this is not just politics, it is economic survival. It is a country trying not to be trapped by another country's decisions. It is a leader trying to turn a threat into an opportunity. It is an economy asking whether it can step out of the shadow of its most powerful neighbor. And the question is simple. What do you do when your most important ally also becomes your greatest risk? Carney's answer seems clear. You do not break the relationship, but you build alternatives. You do not provoke an unnecessary crisis, but you stop pretending there is no problem. You do not answer every threat with shouting, but you prepare your economy to endure. And that is what makes this trip so interesting. While Trump dominates headlines with strong statements, Carney is trying to dominate something else, investor confidence. And confidence can be more powerful than it looks.
A country with confidence attracts capital. A country with capital builds industry. A country with industry creates jobs. A country with jobs gains stability. And a stable country negotiates better. Everything is connected. That is why when Carney appears before Wall Street, he is not only talking about investment, he is talking about economic sovereignty. He is talking about national power. He is talking about how Canada can protect itself in a world where even allies can use the economy as a weapon. Seen that way, the $97 billion are no longer just a statistic. They become the beginning of a larger story. The story of a country that was too comfortable for too long, too confident that the relationship with the United States would always remain stable, too used to the rules staying the same, too sure that North American trade was guaranteed. But Trump broke that illusion. He showed that rules can change, that agreements can be pressured, that allies can be treated like rivals, that a trade border can become a political weapon. And now Canada is reacting. Maybe late, maybe forced by the crisis, but it is reacting. And Carney wants to stand at the center of that reaction. He wants to be seen as the leader who understood the change of era. Because what is at stake is not just one trip to New York, not just one investment number, not just one meeting with CEOs. What is at stake is whether Canada can adapt to a world where the United States is no longer always the predictable partner it once was. And if Canada can adapt, then Trump's pressure does not destroy his strategy, it accelerates it. That would be the great irony. Trump wanted to pressure Canada with tariffs, but he may have pushed Canada toward more independence. Trump wanted to show strength, but he may have given Carney the perfect reason to sell Canada as a stable alternative. Trump wanted to put Canada against the wall, but Carney is trying to open another door on Wall Street, and that door could be the beginning of something much bigger. Because one visit does not transform an economy, one number does not guarantee success, one speech does not build infrastructure, and one meeting with investors does not end dependence on the United States. But it can mark a direction, and in politics, direction matters. First, countries change the language, then they change priorities, then they change alliances, then they change investments, and finally, power changes. Carney is trying to change the language.